When the US dropped bunker-busting bombs on a trio of Iranian nuclear facilities on June 22, it did more than launch an attack that nobody thought was possible. This was the US projecting power, strength. It was an opportunity for the US to showcase what it can do when it's pushed to its limits. And there was one man who was paying very close attention: Russian President Vladimir Putin. The US military's show of force has thrown Putin into panic mode. The US has just sent Putin a very clear message: mess with the bull and you get the horns. Over the weekend, the United States launched a devastating series of aerial and submarine-launched missile attacks against a trio of Iranian nuclear sites: Fordow, Isfahan and Natanz. The US used its bunker-busting GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators on at least two of those sites, with these 30,000-pound bombs each burrowing up to 200 feet into the ground before unleashing their explosive payloads. Early reports from all three sites suggest that the US had been successful. 6 new craters were seen in Fordow, each indicating a bunker busting had landed and penetrated the ground en route to the underground nuclear facility. Isfahan was shown to have been devastated by above-ground strikes, with Natanz seemingly the victim of both cruise missiles and bunker busters. Later, reports emerged that the US may not have been as successful as first anticipated. On June 24, the New York Times reported that the American strike, which was dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, may have only set the Iranian nuclear program back by a few months. Iran had managed to move much of its enriched uranium, including that stored at Fordow, before the attack. Still, even with that uranium, its key nuclear facilities lay in tatters. You can find out more about Operation Midnight Hammer and what it achieved in our video covering the strikes. But what does any of this have to do with Putin? Speaking to Times Radio on June 22, British military commentator Hamish de Bretton-Gordon made it clear. De Bretton-Gordon served as a British Army officer for 23 years and was once the commander of both NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion and the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment. He had this to say about Putin.
President Putin must be sitting in the Kremlin, trembling that the Americans can do this.
And he's right, for several reasons. The first and perhaps most important is that Operation Midnight Hammer exposed a reality that, up until now, Putin either didn't want to face or simply didn't believe existed. Russia's air defenses can do nothing against a concerted aerial assault that involves modern fighter jets and missiles. To understand why, it's necessary to take a closer look at the air defenses that Iran brought to the table when dealing with Operation Midnight Hammer and Israel's earlier Operation Rising Lion. In both cases, Israel and the US overwhelmed Iran's air defenses using modern fighter jets and a massive number of missiles, practically none of which Iran was able to stop. Therein lies the problem for Putin. Everything that Iran has in its air defense arsenal was designed by Russia to stop the very types of attacks the US and Israel have pulled off. According to Military Watch magazine, Iran started investing heavily in ground-based air defense systems back in the 1980s. Then it purchased a network of Chinese HQ-2, which the outlet says were essentially cheap copies of a Soviet-era air defense system named the S-75. It wasn't much, but for a nation like Iran, which had practically no air defenses of which to speak at the time, it was a start. Fast forward to the 1990s, and Iran started buying air defense systems from Russia, namely the S-200D. With its 186-mile range, the S-200D provided complete coverage for Iran's airspace for the first time, even if the system was outdated and required manual reloading to use effectively. By the mid-1990s, Russia began exporting its S-300PM range of air defenses, which offered a notable upgrade over the S-200. In 2007, Iran placed its first order for one of these systems. It also spent much of the 2000s purchasing other short-range Russian-made air defense systems, such as the Tor M1. Iran also managed to purchase some of Russia's modern S-400 air defense systems, which represented another upgrade that the National Security Journal says should have allowed Iran to take on US-made B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. The very bombers that dropped the bunker busters during Operation Midnight Hammer. The point here is that almost everything in Iran's air defense arsenal was made by Russia, or in the case of the HQ-2, was made by a country that was simply copying what Russia built during the Soviet era. And those air defenses failed. There are several potential reasons why that happened. For instance, Israel has already confirmed that it had Mossad agents operating in Iran prior to Operation Rising Lion, which saw Israel launch an initial salvo of airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities and key military personnel. Those agents covertly built a drone factory inside Iran, the products of which the Telegraph claims Israel then used to decimate many of Iran's air defense systems before they ever had a chance to rattle off retaliatory missiles in the direct of the fighter jets and bombers that have taken over Iran's airspace over the last few weeks. But even with these sabotage efforts being successful, Mossad could have taken out every air defense unit Iran had. The S-400 in particular was meant to be capable of shooting down fighter jets and US-made bombers. That's why Russia built it. But just like Iran's older air defense systems, it proved itself to be impotent. As the National Security Journal points out, the S-400 was supposed to be less vulnerable to traditional attacks by fighters with anti-radiation missiles, and it was also supposed to be able to take those fighters down. It didn't. And that's what's worrying Putin so much now. Iran's air defense failure has sent shockwaves through Moscow because it means that Russia's defenses will be just as useless if a nation like the US launches a similar aerial assault as the one seen in Iran against Russia. Matt Oliver, writing for The Telegraph on June 19, explains more. He says that Israel's Operation Rising Lion involved 200 fighter jets, including US-made F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s that were able to strike against Iran with impunity. These strikes involved round trips of about 2,000 miles for manned aircraft, requiring air-to-air refueling over neighboring Syria. Oliver said, the US strikes that came later required aircraft to fly over even longer distances. B-2 Spirit bombers took off from US soil, flew for thousands of miles while occasionally stopping off to refuel in the air, and just like Israel's fighter jets, were able to carry out their strikes without Iran's air defenses even being able to touch them. As Oliver puts it, yet so far not a single Israeli aircraft has been downed, and Iran's Russian-supplied systems appear powerless to stop the Israeli Air Force. The Israeli Air Force used US-made fighter jets. The US itself used B-2 bombers and a huge assortment of supporting aircraft. This outcome highlights Iran's failure, reflecting poorly on Russia's air defense equipment. Oliver also quotes an independent defense analyst named Francis Tusa, who asked the key question, "When's the last time we saw air supremacy like this? I think it would actually be from Israel again in 1967, and before that, probably the Allies in 1944 over Germany. You're talking about an integrated air and missile defense system, previously talked up by the US, being taken down in just 72 hours. 3 days to establish a level of air superiority that hasn't been seen in over half a century. And it all happened because Iran's Russian air defense systems aren't as capable as Putin believed them to be. What Israel and the US have just proven is that its airstrikes can be carried out against Iran, and if that can happen, Putin is shaking in his boots because both Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer are proof that the US could do the same to Russia. Bretton-Gordon hammers this point home in a June 23 article for The Telegraph. He points out that Russia hasn't needed to worry about anything like the concerted aerial assault seen in Iran over the last couple of weeks. Neither side dares to send aircraft even near the enemy front lines, let alone across them. Russians just managed to deliver effective strikes using standoff glide bombs and cruise missiles, and Ukraine has retaliated with drones and limited supplies of long-ranging Western missiles. Now, up until this point, Putin hasn't had to worry about aircraft launching strikes on his territory. He didn't have to. Before he launched his invasion, Ukraine's Air Force only had 105 fighter jets, most of which were ancient MiG-29, Su-24s and Su-25s. Russia knew these jets inside and out because it had built them, meaning it knew its air defenses were capable of taking them out. Even with the arrival of F-16s into Ukraine, which has allowed Ukraine to create some small pockets of temporary air superiority and defend against Russia's constant missile strikes, Putin didn't have to worry. Ukraine wasn't flying any of these jets into Russia, and certainly not so deep that they could launch truly devastating strikes. Even if it was, Ukraine doesn't have the numbers to achieve anything like what Israel and the US have achieved in Iran. Russia's air defenses, at least from the perspective of defending against Western fighter jets, were essentially untested. Instead, Ukraine has been forced to rely on the drone and missile strikes the Bretton-Gordon highlights, and those strikes could have given us some indication as to how useless Russia's air defenses are. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has already lost 1,188 of its air defense systems to Ukrainian attacks. As recently as June 24, United 24 media was reporting that Russia had resorted to using bizarre Hedgehog vans in Ukraine itself. Those vans are equipped with spikes designed to intercept drones, and they're being deployed specifically because Russia's air defenses aren't capable of taking those drones out. And that leads to another point. Not only have Russia's air defenses not been tested by fighter jets, but they're still being destroyed in massive numbers. That can only mean bad things for Putin. He's watched as Iran served as proof that the US could pull off an airstrike on his territory without Russia being able to do anything about it. And with Ukraine having destroyed so many Russian air defense systems already, Putin also has to deal with his defenses being weakened almost by the day as he wages his war of attrition against Ukraine. What Putin has here is a recipe for disaster, and it's this recipe that has him shaking in his boots. As de Bretton-Gordon puts it in his article for The Telegraph, the Russian dictator and his advisors must now have realized that their defenses could easily be suppressed if the Ukrainians or another opponent such as NATO has the right tools. In other words, Russia is overmatched by the US and its allies, and Putin knows it. The UK Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, delivers a similar point to de Bretton-Gordon's. On June 12, he spoke to the UK's Defence Committee, where he was asked if he had any concerns over NATO's resilience in the case of a high casualty war such as that currently taking place in Ukraine.
I genuinely don't tend to subscribe to that anxiety because we are so extraordinarily strong compared to our principal threat, Russia. And the question which is difficult to answer in public, but that you should be asking people like me, is if we were to get into a war with Russia, how quickly could we get control of the air? Because if you have sufficient control of the air, then your ability to put at risk a nation, and especially a nation's economy, is very, very strong.
Radakin has a point. He notes that NATO's collective thinking about Russia has changed. In the past, NATO looked at a conflict with Putin's forces in terms of retaking territory that Russia captures. For instance, if Russia invaded one of the Baltic states, what would NATO do to respond to that invasion so it could recapture the territory? NATO doesn't think like that anymore, as Radakin said on June 12.
It's the overmatch that deters Russia, and I have never been clearer than any time in my career about the success that NATO is having in deterring Russia.
And with the US still being part of NATO and demonstrating just how vital the overmatch is in its operations in Israel, Putin can now see that his air force, including his aerial defenses, doesn't have what it takes to win a larger war than the one being waged in Ukraine right now. Oliver continues this point in his article for The Telegraph. For defense analysts, it's another sign that Russian-made air defense systems, long feared by the NATO alliance, may not be as formidable as they seemed. Putin has lost the fear factor thanks to what the US and Israel have pulled off in Iran. One could almost see those operations as a test run. They certainly represent the first time that Russia's supposedly fearsome air defenses have come up against the sort of threat that NATO could pose to Russia. The defenses came up short. Now, NATO is more confident than ever before that it could pull off something similar against Putin if the collective found itself at war with Russia. This also means that Russia isn't likely to be able to fight the type of war that Putin wants if it comes up against NATO. That's according to former US Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula, who spoke to the Wall Street Journal to point out what a lack of air superiority brings. In the case of Russia-Ukraine war, you see what happens when neither side can achieve air superiority, stalemate and devolution to attrition-based warfare, he said. In the case of the Israel-Iran war, it allows them unhindered freedom to attack where they possess air superiority over segments of Iran. Stalemate and attrition are what Putin wants. His ground forces are still effective in Ukraine, even if they've slowed down. But against a NATO-aligned nation, that tactic isn't going to work. Not because Russia doesn't have the ground forces to overwhelm a smaller nation, such as Latvia or Estonia, but because any attack on their territory is considered an attack against all of NATO, which opens up Russia to strikes made against it by a combined air force that's far more powerful than what Iran's failing air defense systems have faced so far. Iran has to deal with a couple of hundred Israeli fighter jets and a handful of B-2 stealth bombers. If Russia squared off against NATO, the collective could bring 22,377 military aircraft units to the fight, according to Statista in March 2025. Granted, over 7,700 of those aircraft are non-combat helicopters, but that's still a force of close to 15,000 aircraft that could combine to hit much harder than anything seen in Iran so far. And with air defenses that have just proven themselves incapable of dealing with a fraction of that air power, Putin now knows that he can't defend his territory if he starts the war with NATO so many believe he desires. Bretton-Gordon also makes another interesting point in his article for The Telegraph. Up until this point in the Ukraine conflict, Putin hasn't had to worry about any sort of threat being presented to him. All of the risk has been assumed by his soldiers. Over 1 million of them are now dead or wounded thanks to Putin's war, Bretton-Gordon notes. But we can be sure that Putin and his generals will be concerned for their own personal safety, he says. The comprehensive US and Israeli intelligence networks that we have seen in Iran, which even allow them to pinpoint and assassinate key leaders and nuclear scientists almost at will have terrified the Kremlin hierarchy, the more so as Ukraine appears to have similar reach inside Russia. Now remember that Mossad was involved in the success Israel and the US have experienced against Iran. Ukraine has already proven it can work deep into Russian territory, as seen during Operation Spiderweb, which we covered in a video you can check out on our channel. All of the elements were a repeat of what's occurred in Iran, only on a much larger scale, already in place. Putin knows it, he sees it, and there's nothing Russia's leader can do about it. But there's one reason why Putin will be panicking after Operation Midnight Hammer, as mentioned earlier. The fear of Russia's air defense systems is gone. The Globe and Mail made this point in a June 23 article, where it pointed out that decades worth of US presidents before Donald Trump have avoided attacking Iran. For more than 45 years, from Presidents Carter to Biden, every administration concluded that a military strike on Iran was too dangerous, too destabilizing. In the space of an evening, Trump bucked that tradition, with US airstrikes causing the fear that once surrounded Russia's vaunted air defense systems to evaporate. Those strikes have weakened Russia further by essentially taking out a partner upon which Putin relied to provide drones and missiles. Now, any of those weapons Iran builds are going to be focused on Israel and potentially US military bases in the Middle East. But more importantly, Trump's decision to hit Iran hard shows that he's a president who's willing to take a risk. As the Globe and Mail put it, Mr. Trump made a high-stakes gamble on the weekend. Operationally, the US military demonstrated staggering precision and overwhelming force, sending a message heard in every global capital. And nowhere did that message ring louder than in Moscow. Putin will now be asking himself the question, if the US is willing to attack Iran, which is something it avoided for doing for decades, what are the chances it could attack Russia? After all, with ceasefire negotiations in the Ukraine war stalling, Trump may start to see a direct strike against Russia as a potential option. The US president can now feel that sort of strike could work. He's seen it work in Iran, which uses many of the same air defense systems Russia uses. He also sees that Russia's defenses have been weakened by over 3 years of war with Ukraine, and with NATO by America's side, the US could present a far more terrible aerial threat to Russia than anything being posed in Iran. Putin will hope it doesn't come to that. He'll hope that Operation Midnight Hammer draws the US into a deeper conflict that distracts it from Russia. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says that isn't going to happen. Speaking in the wake of the US strikes, he told the press,
and I would just say, as the president has directed and made clear, this is most certainly not open-ended.
In other words, the US isn't intending to use Operation Midnight Hammer as a launching point for further strikes against Iran, though it will respond to Iranian retaliation. A never-ending engagement isn't coming if the US can do anything about it. That lack of continued fighting in the Middle East means that US eyes will soon turn back to Russia, and when that happens, the US will see a foe that is nowhere near as strong as it's claimed to be for so many years. Of course, Putin may not have to wait too long for the US and NATO to bring their combined weight down to bear on Russia. You won't believe what NATO just did for Ukraine. It may already be over for Putin thanks to a massive shift NATO just made that may mean airstrikes may not ever be needed against Russia. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more up-to-date coverage of the aftermath of the US airstrikes in Iran.